The signal didn't come in radio waves. It came in the pattern of dying stars. Dr. Yara Osei was 41 years old, a senior astrophysicist at the Atacama Deep Field Observatory in northern Chile, and she had spent the last 6 years staring at a region of space that nobody else found interesting. Sector 7 Tau. A cold stretch of the Orion Arm where stellar formation had slowed to almost nothing. A neighborhood of old, tired suns and the orbital debris they'd collected over billions of years. Not glamorous. Not funded well. But it was hers. She noticed the anomaly on a Tuesday morning in March 2041. 3 red dwarf stars, spread across 60 light-years, had flickered in sequence. The interval between each pulse was 4.3 seconds. That number nagged at her. She ran it through her calculator 3 times before her coffee went cold. 4.3 seconds. The approximate time it takes a nerve impulse to travel the full length of a human spinal cord and return. A number embedded in every undergraduate neuroscience textbook. Yara didn't tell anyone for 11 days. She spent those 11 days eliminating every other explanation. Gravitational lensing artifacts. Sensor drift. Atmospheric distortion. Instrument calibration errors. She wrote them down in a spiral notebook, crossed them out one by one, and sat in the silence of the observation deck at 3 a.m. with the Milky Way overhead like a smear of old paint. On the 12th day the stars pulsed again. This time in a different pattern, longer intervals, more complex. When she mapped the pulses against prime numbers, they aligned perfectly. Not approximately. Perfectly. She called Dr. Emmanuel Ferraro at the European Space Agency, her closest colleague and the one person she trusted not to immediately leak it to the press. He flew in from Rome within 48 hours. If this is a natural phenomenon, he said, sitting beside her in the dark, watching the playback on her monitor, it's the most structured natural phenomenon ever recorded. It's not natural, Yara said. She was right. What followed was the quietest 6 months in the history of human first contact preparation. No announcements. No press conferences. No leaks. 8 scientists from 5 countries, rotating through the Atacama facility under the cover of a climate observation program. They called themselves the Listening Group, which was modest, given that they were decoding the first confirmed message from an extraterrestrial intelligence. The message was not a greeting. It took 3 months to crack the first layer, a mathematical foundation, almost pedagogical in its structure, as if the sender assumed they were communicating with beings who had discovered calculus but might not have gone further. The Listening Group went further. The second layer was harder. It used a form of symbolic compression that Emmanuel compared to a zip file inside a zip file inside a zip file. The symbols didn't map directly to any human language, but they had internal grammar, rules, repetition, hierarchy. Dr. Sujin Park, a computational linguist from Seoul who had been brought in under strict NDA, spent 6 weeks building a translation matrix by hand. What she extracted, haltingly, imprecisely, was this. We are the Vaythri. We have been watching your star for 90 of your years. We watched because we needed to understand if you were worth saving. We have decided that you are. But you must understand what is coming, and you must understand it quickly because we do not have the luxury of patience anymore. Something is moving through the Orion Arm, something that does not negotiate, does not pause, and does not distinguish between civilizations it considers developed and civilizations it considers nascent. It has consumed 7 inhabited systems in the past 400 years. We know because we escaped one of them. We are sending coordinates. We are sending specifications. We are coming to you because we cannot do this alone, and neither can you. We chose you because of something we did not expect to find. In 90 years of observation, we have never once seen your species stop trying. The decision to bring this to world governments was not made lightly. Director Amara Diallo of the newly formed UN Office of Extraterrestrial Affairs, a position that had existed for 4 years in quiet bureaucratic obscurity, funded as a formality, received the briefing in a secure conference room in Geneva on a gray November morning. She was 53 years old, a former Malian diplomat who had negotiated 3 ceasefire agreements in West Africa and 1 failed climate accord. She was not easily rattled. She listened to the full presentation without interrupting. Yara Osei walked her through every piece of evidence. Emmanuel showed her the data verification. Sujin read the translated message aloud, slowly in English then in French. When it was over, Director Diallo was silent for a long moment. What do they want from us specifically? She asked. They haven't said yet, Yara answered. The coordinates they sent are for a region of space approximately 14 light months from Earth. They're asking us to be there. With what? Whatever we have. Diallo looked at the translated message again, at the line about never once seeing your species stop trying. Then we'd better make sure what we have is worth the trip, she said. The V3 ship entered the solar system on March 3, 2042, just past the orbit of Neptune. It was detected first by the James Webb 3 Space Telescope, which flagged an object moving at 0.003 c, roughly 900 km per second, decelerating in a pattern too controlled to be natural. Within hours, every major space agency on Earth had eyes on it. Within a day, their signal, the prime number pulses, was broadcasting from the object directly. It was answering them. The ship was 2.3 kilometers long. Not enormous by science fiction standards, but enormous by any standard Yara could personally comprehend. Its hull was dark, not painted dark but dark in the way of old iron or cooled lava, a surface that seemed to absorb light without reflecting it. Along its spine, a series of structures projected outward at irregular intervals, like the spines of a deep-sea creature, each one glowing faintly at the tip. It did not approach Earth. It stopped at the L2 Lagrange point, 1.5 million kilometers behind the Moon, and it waited. Yara was on the first shuttle. She had insisted. Director Diallo had tried to send a diplomat, a general, a communications expert. Yara had sat across from her in Geneva and said, "They chose us because of something scientific. They should meet a scientist first." Diallo had looked at her for a long time. "And if it's a trap? Then at least we'll know," Yara said. The shuttle took 9 hours. Yara spent most of it rereading the translated message, particularly the last line. "We chose you because of something we did not expect to find. In 90 years of observation, we have never once seen your species stop trying." She thought about that. About all the things humanity had never stopped trying despite the wars, the famines, the long terrible catalogue of self-inflicted disasters. We kept building anyway. Kept launching things into space. Kept listening. She wondered if the V3 found that admirable or merely useful. She supposed she was about to find out. The shuttle docked with a precision that suggested the V3 had studied human spacecraft engineering thoroughly. The airlock cycled. The atmosphere on the other side registered as breathable, nitrogen-oxygen, slightly drier than Earth standard, slightly higher in CO2. They had prepared for her. The door opened, and Yara Osei stepped through it into a corridor lit by soft amber light, with walls that curved gently inward like the inside of a rib cage, and at the far end of the corridor 3 figures stood waiting. They were tall. Roughly 2.5 meters. Bilaterally symmetrical, bipedal, with 4 arms arranged in 2 pairs. One pair positioned at the shoulder like human arms, the lower pair emerging from the hip. Their faces were broad and flat, with wide-set eyes that caught the amber light and returned it in shades of deep gold. The one in the center stepped forward and raised both upper hands, palms out. A gesture of openness. Possibly universal. It spoke. The sound was layered, 2 or 3 distinct tonal registers simultaneously, like a chord rather than a note. But beneath it, clear and precisely formed in English. "Dr. Osei, we have been hoping to meet someone like you." Yara stopped. She hadn't known they spoke English. "How long have you been learning?" she asked. "Since the signal," the V3 said. 91 years. She stood there in the amber corridor 6 hours from Earth, and understood for the first time that this was not a beginning. This had been in motion for nearly a century. And whatever was coming had been in motion even longer. The V3's name for itself was Kelsavaran, which the translation matrix eventually rendered as something close to "one who carries the record of the burned." Yara called it Kel because human mouths were not built for the full resonance of its name, and because Kel seemed to find the abbreviation acceptable rather than offensive. "We are not naturally inclined toward brevity," it told her, during their 3rd session in what she had started calling the briefing room. A chamber aboard the V3 vessel where the walls could project light in 3 dimensions, assembling images from photon manipulation rather than screen technology. "But we understand that you are. It is one of the things we admire." "What else do you admire?" Yara asked. She had learned that Kel responded better to direct questions than diplomatic preamble. "Your capacity for organized violence," Kel said without a pause. "And your willingness to redirect it." Yara stared at it. "That's a strange compliment." "It is not a compliment. It is an assessment. You have fought wars between yourselves for your entire recorded history, and you have survived them. More than survived, you have maintained continuity of culture, of science, of institutional memory. Civilizations that cannot fight tend to be consumed. Civilizations that only fight tend to consume themselves. You have not yet done either." "Give us time," Yara muttered. Kel's lower arms moved. a gesture she'd come to associate with something like acknowledgement. We did. 91 years of it. The briefing took 4 days. Director Diallo arrived on day 2 with a team of 12 military advisors, engineers, biologists, and 2 psychologists whose job was to assess whether the V3 displayed any signs of deception. They didn't find any. They filed a report that said, essentially, if they are lying, they are doing so in ways completely outside our ability to detect. Diallo had read it twice and then set it aside, because it told her nothing useful and everything frightening. What the V3 told them, systematically and without embellishment, was this. The entity they called the architects. Their name for it did not translate well, the closest approximation being something between the builders of nothing and the erasers, had been documented for 600 years. Not by the V3 alone. By a loose, fractured network of 12 civilizations scattered across the Orion Arm who had each encountered evidence of its passage and eventually, desperately, found each other. It was not a species. Not exactly. It was a distributed intelligence. A network of what the V3 described as processing masses, each one roughly the size of a small moon, moving through inhabited space in a pattern that appeared chaotic but, when mapped across centuries, was not. It consumed information. Not energy, not matter, not primarily. It consumed the organized complexity of living systems, the neural patterns of thinking creatures, the accumulated data structures of civilizations. It did this by a process the V3 called rendering, a term Sujin flagged immediately as significant, because in the V3's original language the word was the same one used for the process of breaking organic tissue into base components. It did not destroy stars. It did not explode planets. It moved through inhabited systems with a quiet, methodical efficiency, and when it was done, the civilizations that had been there were not. 7 confirmed systems in 4 centuries. Possibly more. The V3 network suspected that some encounters had not produced survivors capable of reaching other civilizations with warnings. How large is it? Diallo asked. Kel projected an image in the center of the briefing room. A cluster of objects moving in loose formation through space, 18 masses, irregular in shape, ranging from perhaps 300 kilometers across to almost 1,200. Between them, threads of something that looked almost like light but wasn't, connecting them in a web that pulsed at irregular intervals. This is the configuration we last observed 62 of your years ago, Kel said. At its current projected trajectory, accounting for the deceleration pattern we have observed in previous approaches, it will enter the outer boundary of your solar system in approximately 11 years. The room was very quiet. Why hasn't it attacked your network yet? One of the military advisors asked. Kel was silent for a moment. When it spoke, both its lower registers were subdued, leaving only the highest tone, which Yara had learned to associate with something like grief. 3 of the 12 civilizations in our network no longer exist, it said. We believe we are now 10. Possibly 9. We have lost contact with the Surathi in the past 20 years. The question that nobody wanted to ask, that Yara eventually asked because nobody else would, was, why come to us? Humanity was, by V3 reckoning, one of the younger technological civilizations they were aware of. Their spacefaring history was less than a century old in any meaningful sense. Their fastest ships could manage perhaps 0.008 C under optimal conditions. Their weapons technology was, as Kel diplomatically but unmistakably implied, impressive in the context of planetary warfare and nearly irrelevant in the context of open space. So why? Yara asked. They were alone in the briefing room. Late, by shipboard clock, past what Kel had identified as its own rest cycle, though it didn't seem to need the same quantity of rest as humans. The light was dimmed. Kel's golden eyes caught it. Because you manufacture faster than any civilization we have encountered, it said. When you decide to build something, you build it at a speed that our models consistently underestimate. Yara frowned. You're talking about industrial capacity. I am talking about something more than industry. I'm talking about urgency. Your species operates as though it believes it might run out of time. Every one of you. Even in your leisure, there is a tension, a sense of limited duration. Our psychologists have theorized about this extensively. The brevity of your individual lives, perhaps. Whatever the cause, the effect is that when humans commit to a project, they work as though they are running out of time. We usually are. Yes, Kel said. And so are we. It pulled up a schematic in the air between them, a technical diagram, dense with notation in the V3 system that Sujin's team was still only partially able to read. We have been developing a technology for 40 years, Kel said. A means of disrupting the architect's communication network, the threads you saw in the projection. If those threads are severed, each mass becomes isolated. Isolated, they can be engaged individually. Destroyed, perhaps, or at minimum driven off. But we cannot complete the technology in time with our current manufacturing capacity. Not before it reaches your system. Not before it reaches ours. You need us to build it, Yara said. We need you to build it faster than we can. We will provide the design. We will provide the materials we cannot source from your system. We will provide everything we have. But the construction, the sheer, relentless, around-the-clock construction, that requires a workforce with your particular relationship to time. Yara sat with that for a moment. You're asking us to save the solar system by running a very large factory. I am asking you, Kel said, with something in its upper register that she could only describe as careful hope, to do what you have always done. Work until the problem is solved. She called Diallo that morning in Geneva, and laid it out plainly. They need us as a manufacturing partner, she said. They have the blueprint. We have the hands. Diallo was quiet for a moment. And if we say no? Yara looked out the viewport at the stars, at the cold dark where something enormous and hungry was moving toward them. Then in 11 years, she said, we find out what it's like to be a civilization that used to exist. Another silence. Longer this time. Send me the schematic, Diallo said. The news went public on April 14, 2042. Director Diallo had wanted to control the rollout, to sequence it carefully, V3 contact first, threat second, proposal third. The sequencing didn't survive contact with reality. A signals analyst at the Goldstone Deep Space Communication Complex had been tracking the V3 vessel since its arrival and had quietly uploaded his data to an astronomy forum 3 days before the official announcement. By the time Diallo held the press conference, every major news organization had already run at least one story. Yara watched the press conference from a screen aboard the V3 vessel. Kel stood beside her. It had developed a habit of attending her screenings of human media events, observing with the focused stillness of something trying to learn quickly. The global response was, predictably, not a single thing. There was panic, brief but intense, a 48-hour spike in crisis calls to mental health services that governments scrambled to address. There was denial, coordinated, well-funded denial, claiming the V3 were a hoax or a false flag operation or a government-manufactured crisis. There was religious response, which ranged from welcoming. Several major traditions released statements framing the V3 as fellow created beings, to apocalyptic. An equally vocal contingent insisted the architects were divine punishment. And then, about a week in, something else started to happen. Engineers started calling their professional associations. Not asking what to do, asking how to get involved. Universities began reorganizing research priorities without being asked. Machine shops in Germany, South Korea, Brazil, and India posted public offers to the UN Coordination Office. We have capacity. Tell us what you need built. They are afraid, Kel observed, watching a clip from a town hall in Manchester where residents were arguing loudly about the threat while simultaneously organizing a local manufacturing cooperative. Yes, Yara said. And yet they are organizing. That's what we do when we're afraid. We get busy. Kel's lower arms made the acknowledgement gesture. We had modeled this as a possibility. Our psychologists called it the productivity-fear correlation. They assigned it a probability of 32%. And the other 68%? Paralysis, or fragmentation. We estimated a significant chance of armed conflict between your nation-states over resource allocation before cooperation could be established. Give it time, Yara said for the second time since they'd met. We're not done yet. The project, as it came to be universally called, was formally ratified by the UN Security Council on June 2, 2042, with a unanimity that no previous UN resolution had achieved. This was partly due to diplomatic groundwork, partly due to genuine terror, and partly, Yara suspected, due to the fact that the V3 had released a partial rendering of what the architects had done to the Surathi homeworld, drawn from records recovered by a V3 survey vessel 40 years earlier. The images were not violent in any conventional sense. There were no explosions, no scorched surfaces. The Surathi world looked, from orbit, almost normal. The atmosphere was intact. The oceans were in place. But the cities were silent. Not ruined, silent. And when the survey team had landed, they had found something that the V3 briefers described only in the most clinical language they could manage. The population had been there, and then they had not been there, and what remained in the spaces they had occupied was a fine, organized residue that the V3's instruments identified as the base chemical components of complex neural tissue. The architects had not destroyed the Surathi. They had read them. Construction began in October 2042, in 7 locations simultaneously. The primary facility was in high Earth orbit, a structure built out from the existing framework of the International Deep Space Platform, expanded at a rate that made the original IDSP construction look leisurely. The V3 contributed 3 fabrication systems that operated on principles Earth engineers spent the first 2 months simply trying to understand before concluding it was faster to just use them. The device being constructed, the V3 called it the Severance Array, a name that the human press immediately shortened to the Array, was not a weapon in any traditional sense. It projected a modulated field across vast distances, one that interacted specifically with the architect's communication threads in a way that disrupted their coherence. Think of it, one engineer explained to a journalist, as a carefully tuned radio jammer. Except the radio is made of something we don't fully understand, and the jammer requires a power source the size of a small city. Human engineers loved it. Not the threat. Not the enemy. The problem. Yara watched it happen from both sides. She spent half her time aboard the V3 vessel, half on the ground, serving as the primary liaison between the 2 species' technical teams. She watched V3 engineers, precise, methodical, deeply uncomfortable with improvisation, interact with human engineers who treated, "we've never done this before," as an invitation rather than a warning. There was friction. There was significant friction. A V3 fabricator named Turalathck, Tur in the shorthand the human team adopted, nearly terminated the joint session on the array's power coupling after a human engineer named Marcus Webb suggested bypassing 3 of the V3 safety protocols to speed up the integration process. The protocols exist because their failure modes are catastrophic, Tur said in the flat, controlled English it had learned in the 6 months since contact. We do not bypass them. We've looked at the failure modes, Marcus said, pulling up a screen full of calculations. And we think if you add a secondary containment loop here, he pointed, you can bypass the protocol and actually get a safer outcome than the original design. Tur looked at the calculations. A long pause. Its lower arms were very still. You found this in how long? It asked. 4 days, Marcus said. Well, 2 of us. Working nights. Another pause. Show me the secondary containment math, Tur said. It took 6 hours. At the end of it, Tur sent a formal notation to the V3 Engineering Council recommending the modification be adopted across all array components, with credit attributed to the human team. When Yara heard about this, she found Marcus in the orbital facility's canteen, drinking terrible coffee and looking exhausted. Tur sent you a formal commendation, she told him. He blinked. Really? The V3 equivalent of 1. Apparently it's the first time they've formally credited a human team with an original technical contribution. Marcus shrugged, the way engineers shrug when they're quietly pleased. It was a good problem, he said. I just really didn't want it to take 3 more months. 9 months into the project, a V3 survey vessel detected something at the edge of the solar system's Oort cloud. The architects had not altered their trajectory, but they had accelerated. Kel brought the data to Yara at 0300 shipboard time, which meant it was urgent enough to wake her. She looked at the numbers for a long time. They know we're building something, she said. We believe so. The architects have demonstrated, in previous encounters, a capacity to detect large-scale field manipulation technology at significant range. How much time have we lost? If the acceleration is maintained, the timeline moves from 11 years to approximately 6. Yara was quiet. 6 years. The array was projected to take 8 at current construction pace. Then we need to build faster, she said. Our current projections indicate that even with a 30% increase in construction rate, which is the maximum we estimated as achievable. Don't use our estimates, Yara said. Ask Marcus. Kel paused. Excuse me? Find Marcus Webb. Tell him the timeline. Ask him what's possible. She paused. Then add 20% to whatever he says. Kel's golden eyes watched her for a moment. You are confident in his response. I'm confident in the type of response, she said. He'll say something's impossible, work out that it's not quite impossible, and then be annoyed that he didn't think of the solution faster. That's the process. And the 20% addition? Because humans always underestimate what they can do when they're scared enough, Yara said, and right now we're plenty scared. She was right as it turned out. But only just. The second year of the project nearly broke 3 things. The budget framework of every major economy on Earth, the diplomatic relationship between the V3 network and the Human Coordination Council and Marcus Webb. The budget crisis was paradoxically the easiest to solve. When the alternative to spending is not existing, fiscal conservatism loses most of its philosophical force. The global emergency framework that Director Diallo's office had quietly drafted 18 months before the announcement was invoked, international sovereign debt obligations were formally suspended by mutual agreement, and a unified project fund was established that economists would spend the next generation arguing about and that, at the time, nobody argued about at all because there were more pressing concerns. The diplomatic rupture was harder. It started with a disagreement between the Human Engineering Council and the V3 Technical Authority over the array's primary emitter design. The human team, led by Dr. Priya Anand, a plasma physicist from Bangalore who had joined the project in its third month and risen to lead the emitter division through a combination of genuine brilliance and total immunity to sleep deprivation, had proposed a modification to the emitter geometry that would increase output by an estimated 40%. The V3 Authority rejected it. Not because the math was wrong. The math was correct, and Turalath Sek confirmed this privately to Yara. The rejection was on the grounds that the modification required a form of field shaping that the V3 had tested 40 years earlier, in a different context, and that had produced side effects they classified under a term that translated imperfectly as cascading complexity collapse. A failure mode in which a system that becomes too efficient at one function begins to compromise its own structural coherence. They're saying it might work too well, Priya told Yara, in a voice that conveyed precisely how she felt about that. They're saying they've seen this fail before, Yara said. They've seen a different version of it fail. This is a different context, a different scale, different materials. I know. If they veto this, we lose the 40% gain. That's the difference between finishing in time and not finishing in time. I know, Priya. So what do we do? Yara went back to Kel. They had, by this point, been working together for almost 2 years. The relationship had evolved from something careful and formal into something she could only describe as collegial. Not warm exactly because the V3 seemed to experience warmth differently but honest. Kel told her things it didn't tell Director Diallo's office. She told it things she didn't put in official reports. Tell me about the cascade failure, she said. Kel told her. It took 3 hours and it included a projection of the test event from 40 years ago. A V3 research installation in a system Yara had no name for, where a field emitter not entirely unlike Priya's design had achieved its target output and then, over the course of 8 days, begun to generate secondary fields that interfered with the quantum coherence of materials within range. Not explosively. Quietly. Metal became brittle. Electronics became unreliable. Eventually the installation had to be abandoned. Was anyone hurt? Yara asked. No. We detected the secondary effect early enough. But the cascade had reached a radius of 40 kilometers before we shut the primary emitter down. Kel paused. In open space, the radius would not be limited in the same way. So if Priya's emitter experiences the same cascade, the secondary field would propagate outward at an undetermined rate. The array and all ships within range would be affected. Yara was quiet. Did you tell the technical authority this? Of course. Did you tell them that Priya's design uses a different material composition for the resonance chamber? One that we don't have 40-year-old data on. Pause. That detail was not part of the formal presentation. It should have been. Kel's lower arm stilled. You believe the material difference is significant. I believe we don't know if it's significant. And that's different from knowing it's dangerous. Yara leaned forward. Kel, your authority vetoed this based on a precedent that might not apply. I'm not saying it's definitely safe. I'm saying we don't know yet, and vetoing it means we never find out, and the timeline doesn't work without the gain. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that Priya builds a subscale test unit here in this facility with every V3 safety monitor you can deploy. And we run it and we watch, and if the cascade appears we shut it down, and if it doesn't we have your data. And if the technical authority refuses the test? Yara looked at Kel steadily. Then I need to know if you think they're right. It was the most direct thing she had ever asked Kel. The silence that followed was long enough that she started to wonder if she'd overstepped. I think, Kel said slowly, that the technical authority is following procedure correctly. Procedure was built from experience and the experience says caution. But I also think, it paused again, that you are correct that the precedent is imperfect. And I think that what your species does with imperfect precedent is different from what we do. What do we do with it? You test the edges of it. You look for where it doesn't apply. Something shifted in Kel's upper register, a warmth Yara had never heard before. It is, I think, both your greatest risk and your most valuable characteristic. The test was approved. Priya built the subscale unit in 11 days. They ran it for 3 weeks under continuous monitoring by a joint team of human and V3 engineers, 2 of whom did not sleep for the first 4 days and had to be medically relieved. The cascade did not appear. The modified design was adopted. Marcus Webb's near breakdown happened quietly, the way these things often do in people who are very good at hiding them. Yara found him sitting in an unused section of the orbital facility's observation ring at 0400, looking at Earth through the viewport. He'd been the lead on the array's power distribution network for 14 months. His team had solved 11 problems that the V3 engineers had classified as potentially timeline fatal and found workarounds for all of them. He had taken 4 days off in 14 months, and 2 of those were because a microfracture in a coupling junction had caused a depressurization event that grounded all personnel while repairs were made. She sat down beside him and didn't say anything for a while. "I've been doing math," he said eventually. "What kind of math?" 11 years, he said. "The original timeline. We've been going 14 months. We need to finish in," he checked his tablet, "roughly 55 more months. We're at about 40% of target completion. To hit the deadline we need to be at something like 19% per month for the rest of the build. Are we on track? Last month we hit 16. He set the tablet down. "I've been telling everyone 16 is fine, 16 is within the variance, we can make it up. But I've run the numbers 12 different ways and I keep getting the same result and I'm really tired, Yara." She looked at him. He was 38 years old and looked 50. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need 3 months and a different brain." "The 3 months we can't give you." She paused. "What's the bottleneck?" He pointed at his tablet. "The synchronization problem. The array has 47 emitter nodes. For the field to work correctly, they all have to fire within 0.003 seconds of each other, adjusted for their spatial positions. We have the timing tech for about 30 of the nodes. The last 17, he shook his head, the variance is too high. We missed the window, the field doesn't cohere, the whole thing is wasted. What have you tried? He listed 6 approaches. She listened carefully. Have you talked to Tour's team about it? They say it's a fundamental limit of the technology. They said the power coupling protocols were non-bypassable. He looked at her. The orbital sunlight was coming through the viewport now, the slow rotation of the station bringing Earth into view, the curve of it, the impossible blue. He stared at it for a moment. "I'll set up a joint session," he said. He found the solution in 6 weeks, working with 2 V3 engineers who had specialized in timing harmonics for a completely unrelated application, the synchronization of the V3's long-range communication relays. The solution was not elegant. It was a hybrid of 2 different technological traditions, required more computing power than any single existing system could provide, and had to be distributed across a network of nodes in a way that Tour described as architecturally uncomfortable. It worked within a tolerance of 0.0008 seconds. When Yara told him the V3 timing team had sent a formal commendation, Marcus looked at her and said, "Tell them we're even." It was Dr. Sujin Park who first understood what the architects actually were. She'd been working on the problem from the beginning, not the engineering, not the construction, but the linguistic and conceptual translation work that everyone agreed was important and nobody quite knew what to do with. She spent most of her time aboard the V3 vessel, in a workspace Kel had set aside for her, surrounded by 3 screens and 17 notebooks filled with handwritten notation. Her formal title was Chief Xenolinguistics Officer, which was a title that had never existed before and would, she privately hoped, never need to exist again. She called Yara at 0600 on a Thursday in January 2044, which meant it was the middle of the night in the orbital facility and Yara was asleep, but Sujin had stopped apologizing for the timing of her breakthroughs approximately 4 months into the project. "I need you and Kel in the workspace," she said. "I figured out what they are, and you both need to hear this at the same time." What Sujin had spent 3 years doing was not simply translating between languages. She had been mapping the conceptual architecture of 2 different alien intelligences. The V3, who communicated in layered tonal harmonics that encoded meaning at multiple registers simultaneously, and the architects, whose communication Sujin had been analyzing from the records the V3 network had accumulated over centuries. The architects didn't communicate in language. They communicated in structural change. "Every time they've engaged with an inhabited system," Sujin said, standing beside a projection that covered 2 full walls of her workspace, "there's been a period of what the V3 records describe as pre-engagement activity. The architects move through the outer system and during this period, weeks, sometimes months, there are detectable changes in certain physical constants in the local space. Tiny changes. Well within measurement error if you're looking at any single data point. But the V3 have records from 7 systems, and when I mapped all the pre-engagement patterns together, she pointed at the projection where 7 sets of wave patterns had been overlaid, they're identical. They're saying something, Yara said. They're not saying it. They're doing it. The change in local physical constants is the message. It's like, imagine if instead of writing a letter you rearranged the furniture in the room. Anyone who knew the original configuration would understand the change. Anyone who didn't would just see furniture. Kel had been very still through this. What are they communicating? As best I can tell, Sujin said, they're introducing themselves. The pattern is a kind of signature, a proof of their presence. They're announcing that they're there. To whom? Yara asked. Sujin paused. This was the part she'd spent 3 weeks convincing herself she wasn't wrong about. To each other, she said. But not to the specific masses in the current group. To all of them. Any of them. Anywhere. She pulled up another projection. I think the architects are not a fleet. I don't think the 18 masses we've identified are a unit. I think they're fragments of something much larger, a distributed intelligence that has been expanding and moving through this part of the galaxy for potentially millions of years. The 18 masses moving toward us are one node of something that might have thousands of nodes across the Orion arm. The room was very quiet. The V3 records contain reference to a classification system they developed, Sujin continued, for ranking threats on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is a civilization-ending event. They classified the architects as an 8. She looked at Kel. But that was before I found this. She pulled up the final projection. A map of the Orion arm covered in data points. I've been cross-referencing the pre-engagement signature, the physical constant changes, against astronomical records from the V3 network going back 300 years. And I found it in places where no architect presence has ever been confirmed. She zoomed in on several of the data points. Here, and here. They've been everywhere, Yara said quietly. They've been through the Orion arm at least twice in recorded history. Maybe more. What we've been classifying as star formation anomalies, unexplained gravitational variants, dead systems with intact stellar structures. Sujin's voice was very controlled. Some of those are theirs. How many? Kel asked. The array was completed on March 8, 2048, at 1433 Universal Time Coordinated. Not in 55 months as Marcus's most optimistic calculations had projected. Not in 63 months as the official project timeline stated. In 51 months and 19 days, driven by a final push that had every manufacturing facility on Earth and in orbit running continuous triple-shift operations, coordinated by an AI logistics system that Priya Anand's team had built in the project's 4th year specifically because no human being could track the interdependencies of 412,000 separate construction tasks across 7 orbital platforms and 32 ground facilities. It was not technically finished. Several secondary systems were still being calibrated. The redundant power coupling, a human addition to the V3 original design, was operating at 84% efficiency. 14 of the 47 emitter nodes were running on the backup timing protocol because the primary had developed an interference pattern that Marcus's team was still tracing. It was also the most complex object human hands had ever built. The architect's leading masses crossed the heliopause, the boundary of the solar system, on March 3, 5 days before the array came online. They moved at 0.0012 c, slower than their approach velocity, in the methodical deceleration pattern the V3 had observed in every previous engagement. The architects did not send communications. They did not hail. They did not pause. They adjusted their formation as they crossed the boundary, the 18 masses spreading into a configuration that the V3 analysts had seen before, in records from one of the confirmed consumed systems. It was the pre-engagement formation. The announcement had already been made 23 years ago. They were simply confirming their arrival. There was no countdown in the end. No dramatic synchronization. No last-minute ceremony. Director Diallo was in the primary command facility on the orbital platform. Yara was there too beside Kel and 2 other senior V3 officers. Marcus was in the power distribution hub 3 sections away, surrounded by his team and 6 screens of real-time telemetry. Priya was at the emitter control station. Sujin was in the observation deck recording everything because someone had to. The architect's leading mass was $8.40 from Earth, approximately the distance between the Sun and Saturn, when Priya activated the array. The field didn't look like anything from the outside. No visible light, no dramatic discharge, no beam cutting through space. The array emitted in a frequency range that no human eye could see and no conventional instrument was originally designed to measure. The V3 had built the monitoring equipment specifically for this, and on the displays in the command facility, it showed as a wave pattern propagating outward from the array's central hub at approximately 0.7 c. It reached the leading mass in 71 minutes. For a moment, 4 seconds, which Yara counted, which everyone in the room counted, nothing changed. Then the threads between the masses, the communication web, the thing that made them a collective rather than 18 separate objects, flickered. "We have coherence disruption," said the V3 monitoring officer, in a tone that conveyed for the first time something that sounded like relief. The threads flickered again. And then, over the course of the next 20 minutes, one by one, they went dark. What happened next took 3 weeks to confirm. The masses did not stop. They did not reverse. But their formation, the pre-engagement spread, the configuration that had preceded consumption in every documented case, began to dissolve. Individual masses altered their trajectories. Slightly at first, then more substantially. Within 10 days, 4 of the 18 were moving on vectors that would take them out of the solar system entirely. The others decelerated further. Milk. The word that kept appearing in Yara's head was confused, though she knew that was almost certainly projection. But the pre-engagement pattern did not reform. On day 18, the V3 monitoring officer, Yara had learned its name by now, Velsathkur Vel, reported that 3 more masses had begun moving outward. On day 21, Kel brought Yara a data report and set it on the table in front of her without speaking. She read it. "All 18, she said. "All 18, Kel confirmed. "They're leaving. They are withdrawing. We cannot confirm they will not return. The second nearest group," Kel paused, "will receive, by our estimates, some form of notification from this group within 40 to 60 years. What they do with that information is unknown. But we have time. You have time." Yara looked at the data report for a long moment. Outside the viewport, Earth was turning, the gray-blue Atlantic catching sunlight as it rotated into morning. "My father used to say," she said, "that the most dangerous words in any language are 'we have time.' Because people who have time stop working. And you intend to prevent that." "I intend to try." She looked at Kel. "How many of the V3 network are still intact?" 7 confirmed. "Possibly 8. We believe we may have re-established contact with the Surathi remnant population. They evacuated a colony before the engagement. Approximately 40,000 survivors. And the others?" Kel's lower registers went quiet. "Gone." Yara was still for a moment. "Then we need to build more arrays. And we need to share what we built, the modifications, the improvements, everything we learned. Every civilization in the network gets the full technical package. They may not have the manufacturing capacity. We'll help," Yara said. "We're going to be very busy for the next 30 years, Kel. But I think we already knew that." Kel's golden eyes caught the light from the viewport, the Earth light, warm and blue. "When we observed your species for 91 years, it said, one of our analysts wrote in a report I was given in my first year of training, they appear to function best in the presence of an impossible task. I was trained to read this as a vulnerability. A tendency to overextend. And now?" Yara asked. "Now I read it as a description of an engine," Kel said. "One that, given sufficient fuel, does not know how to stop. I've identified 47 candidate systems so far. Possibly more. I need more data." She looked at the projection for a moment. "Kel, the architects didn't start with the 7 confirmed systems. They've been doing this for a very long time. And the pre-engagement signature we should look for in our own system," Yara began. "I already looked." Sujin pulled up one final graph. "It's there. In data from 23 years ago. Before anyone was looking for it. They marked us 23 years ago," Yara said. "Yes. Before you sent the signal," she said to Kel. "Yes." Kel's voice was very quiet. "We did not know. If we had." "No," Yara said firmly. "If you had known, you still would have come to us. Because we're the only ones building the array fast enough." She paused. "Does this change the array's effectiveness?" "No," Sujin said. "The array disrupts the communication threads between the current group of masses. It doesn't matter how many other groups exist, disrupting this one gives us time." "How much time?" "For the next nearest group to respond and redirect?" "Based on movement data," she calculated, "at least 30 years. Maybe 50. "Enough time to build another array," Yara said. "Enough time to build several," Sujin said. "If we start now." There was a silence. Then Yara said, "We'd better start now then?" The array was completed on March 8, 2048, at 14:33 Universal Time Coordinated. Not in 55 months as Marcus's most optimistic calculations had projected. Not in 63 months as the official project timeline stated. In 51 months and 19 days, driven by a final push that had every manufacturing facility on Earth and in orbit running continuous triple-shift operations, coordinated by an AI logistics system that Priya Anand's team had built in the project's fourth year specifically because no human being could track the interdependencies of 412,000 separate construction tasks across 7 orbital platforms and 32 ground facilities. It was not technically finished. Several secondary systems were still being calibrated. The redundant power coupling, a human addition to the V3 original design, was operating at 84% efficiency. 14 of the 47 emitter nodes were running on the backup timing protocol because the primary had developed an interference pattern that Marcus's team was still tracing. It was also the most complex object human hands had ever built. The architect's leading masses crossed the heliopause, the boundary of the solar system, on March 3, 5 days before the array came online. They moved at 0.0012 c, slower than their approach velocity, in the methodical deceleration pattern the V3 had observed in every previous engagement. The architects did not send communications. They did not hail. They did not pause. They adjusted their formation as they crossed the boundary, the 18 masses spreading into a configuration that the V3 analysts had seen before, in records from one of the confirmed consumed systems. It was the pre-engagement formation. The announcement had already been made 23 years ago. They were simply confirming their arrival. There was no countdown in the end. No dramatic synchronization. No last-minute ceremony. Director Diallo was in the primary command facility on the orbital platform. Yara was there too beside Kel and 2 other senior V3 officers. Marcus was in the power distribution hub 3 sections away, surrounded by his team and 6 screens of real-time telemetry. Priya was at the emitter control station. Sujin was in the observation deck recording everything because someone had to. The architect's leading mass was $8.40 from Earth, approximately the distance between the Sun and Saturn, when Priya activated the array. The field didn't look like anything from the outside. No visible light, no dramatic discharge, no beam cutting through space. The array emitted in a frequency range that no human eye could see and no conventional instrument was originally designed to measure. The V3 had built the monitoring equipment specifically for this, and on the displays in the command facility, it showed as a wave pattern propagating outward from the array's central hub at approximately 0.7 c. It reached the leading mass in 71 minutes. For a moment, 4 seconds, which Yara counted, which everyone in the room counted, nothing changed. Then the threads between the masses, the communication web, the thing that made them a collective rather than 18 separate objects, flickered. "We have coherence disruption," said the V3 monitoring officer, in a tone that conveyed for the first time something that sounded like relief. The threads flickered again. And then, over the course of the next 20 minutes, one by one, they went dark. What happened next took 3 weeks to confirm. The masses did not stop. They did not reverse. But their formation, the pre-engagement spread, the configuration that had preceded consumption in every documented case, began to dissolve. Individual masses altered their trajectories. Slightly at first, then more substantially. Within 10 days, 4 of the 18 were moving on vectors that would take them out of the solar system entirely. The others decelerated further. Milk. The word that kept appearing in Yara's head was confused, though she knew that was almost certainly projection. But the pre-engagement pattern did not reform. On day 18, the V3 monitoring officer, Yara had learned its name by now, Velsathkur Vel, reported that 3 more masses had begun moving outward. On day 21, Kel brought Yara a data report and set it on the table in front of her without speaking. She read it. "All 18, she said. "All 18, Kel confirmed. "They're leaving. They are withdrawing. We cannot confirm they will not return. The second nearest group," Kel paused, "will receive, by our estimates, some form of notification from this group within 40 to 60 years. What they do with that information is unknown. But we have time. You have time." Yara looked at the data report for a long moment. Outside the viewport, Earth was turning, the gray-blue Atlantic catching sunlight as it rotated into morning. "My father used to say," she said, "that the most dangerous words in any language are 'we have time.' Because people who have time stop working. And you intend to prevent that." "I intend to try." She looked at Kel. How many of the V3 network are still intact? 7 confirmed. Possibly 8. We believe we may have re-established contact with the Surathi remnant population. They evacuated a colony before the engagement. Approximately 40,000 survivors. And the others? Kel's lower registers went quiet. Gone. Yara was still for a moment. Then we need to build more arrays. And we need to share what we built, the modifications, the improvements, everything we learned. Every civilization in the network gets the full technical package. They may not have the manufacturing capacity. We'll help, Yara said. We're going to be very busy for the next 30 years, Kel. But I think we already knew that. Kel's golden eyes caught the light from the viewport, the Earth light, warm and blue. When we observed your species for 91 years, it said, one of our analysts wrote in a report I was given in my first year of training, they appear to function best in the presence of an impossible task. I was trained to read this as a vulnerability, a tendency to overextend. And now? Yara asked. Now I read it as a description of an engine, Kel said. One that, given sufficient fuel, does not know how to stop. Most of those conversations were about practical things. Engineering, biology, materials science, logistics. But some of them were about other things. Turalathasike, who had spent 9 years on the project and then returned to V3 space, sent Yara a message 40 years later. She'd written to it occasionally, through the light-speed delay that made correspondence a careful, deliberate thing. It had always responded. The message said, I have been asked by a younger member of our technical council to describe what I learned from working with human engineers. I told them, I learned that the boundary between possible and impossible is a location you walk toward rather than a fixed wall. This is not how we were trained to approach problems. It was uncomfortable. It remains uncomfortable. But I find I am more useful than I was. Yara had read the message 3 times and then printed it and put it on the wall of her office in Nairobi, where it still hung. She ended her lecture with something she hadn't planned to say. She'd been looking at the faces in the hall, human and V3 and Ketsurai and Surathi, all of them young, all of them living in a world where the existence of the coalition was simply a fact, where the arrays were infrastructure, where the threat of the architects was a known quantity rather than an incomprehensible revelation. Here is what I want you to understand, she said. We did not win. I want to be very precise about that. The architects withdrew. They may return. The next engagement, when it comes, will require everything we have built in the past 4 decades and probably more. The 11 arrays are not enough. The coalition is not complete. The shared technical library has 38 times as much data as any individual civilization can process. We are, by any honest measure, still in the early stages of figuring out what we are up against. She paused. But here is also what I want you to understand. 41 years ago, 12 civilizations, 10 by the time we met, were scattered across the Orion Arm, isolated, defending themselves individually, losing. Today we are a coalition of 7 active members with 3 more in the accession process. We share technology. We share resources. We share, in some meaningful sense, a purpose. That was not given to us by the architects. We built it ourselves in the time they allowed us. She looked at the V3 student in the front row. One of the first things Kel Savaran said to me, Kel, who is now the V3 ambassador to the coalition and who I am told is sitting in this building's lobby right now because it wanted to attend this lecture but refused to take a seat from a student, scattered laughter, was that they had observed my species for 91 years and had never once seen us stop trying. She let the room settle. I want you to make that true for the next 91 years. Not because it will definitely be enough, but because it is the only thing that has ever actually worked. She found Kel in the lobby afterward. It was taller than she remembered from their early years, or perhaps she was smaller now, the slow compression of age. Its golden eyes were unchanged. It raised both upper hands, palms out. You came, she said. I have never missed any of your lectures, it said. I know. She stood beside it, looking at the students streaming out of the hall. Young faces, different faces, talking to each other in a mixture of languages that would have been impossible 40 years ago. How do you think we're doing? Kel considered the question with the seriousness it had always given serious questions. I think, it said, that you are doing what you have always done. Stumbling forward? I was going to say not stopping, Kel said. But I suppose both are accurate. Yara laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of someone who has spent a lifetime finding the human and the alien to be more similar than different and still hasn't quite gotten used to it. Outside, Nairobi was loud and warm in the afternoon sun, and in the sky above it, if you knew where to look, You could just barely see the bright steady point of the array's orbital platform catching the light. It looked like a star. It was better than a star. It was something that had been built by hands that had never met, in service of a future that wasn't guaranteed, by beings who had decided that running out of time was not the same as giving up. That was the thing about humanity that the Veythri had observed for 91 years and found so improbable they'd almost dismissed it. Not that humans were brave. Not that they were smart or capable or innovative. Just that they kept going. Even when the dark was very large and the light they carried was very small. They kept going.